Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to explore randomness, the fascinating and often counterintuitive world of randomness, I should say. We'll be drawing insights from Leonard Mlodinow's book, The Drunkard's Walk, How Randomness Rules Our Lives, to see just how much chance really impacts us every day.
Yeah, it's easy to miss how much randomness impacts us. Because like Mlodinow says, it's kind of behind the scenes. Most of the time, we're focused on the things we can control, you
Hmm.
know? The decisions we make, what we do, but we often miss the unexpected turns that happen, just life-throwing curveballs.
Right, yeah, totally. Okay, so let's jump into some specifics from the book. One that really got me was the table-turning seances in the 19th century. Those were wild,
Yeah.
you know, where everyone gathers around the table, puts their hands on it, waits for it to move. They were sure it was spirits.
It's so interesting how something so supernatural can actually tell us so much about how our minds work. Psychologist Ellen Langer's research actually found that the people at the table, their expectations and their desire to be in control, were actually making the table move. They expected it to move so unconsciously, they moved it themselves.
So it wasn't ghosts, it was their own minds.
Yeah.
Creating that illusion of some external force. That's a perfect example of what Mlodinow calls the illusion of control. We think we have way more power over what happens than we do, and we don't give enough credit to luck. And this bias, it pops up in some weird ways, right?
Absolutely. Langer did other experiments that show this bias even more clearly. Like she found that people were way more confident in a card game, even when it was totally random, when they were playing against someone who seemed nervous, even though their chances of winning were totally random. And in another study, people thought that the lottery tickets they chose themselves were worth way more than the ones they were given randomly, even though the odds were exactly the same.
It's like just the act of choosing, even if it doesn't actually change the outcome, makes us feel like we're in control. It's pretty crazy when you think about it. It makes you wonder, how often do we think outcomes are from skill or decisions, when really luck had more to do with it than we know?
Oh, all the time. And this bias can really impact the decisions we make. For example, let's say you're hiring someone. You might be more likely to choose someone who's had a bunch of successes at their last job without thinking about how much of that might have just been luck. Or let's say you're investing. You might go for the hot stocks or funds, assuming that because they've done well before, they'll keep doing well. But in reality, it could just be a lucky streak.
So the next time you're looking at someone's successes or failures, or you're making a big decision, remember to think about luck. It's not about dismissing hard work or skill. It's just about recognizing that chance often plays a bigger part than we'd like to admit. Speaking of misjudging expertise, Milana now uses a really interesting story about Sherry Lansing. She was a super successful Hollywood executive.
Yeah, her story is a great example of how we tend to overemphasize how much impact individual decisions have and underestimate the influence of randomness. Lansing got fired from Paramount Pictures after they had a string of movies that did terribly at the box office. But here's the thing, those movies were already being made before she even started working there. So basically, she got fired based on how projects that she had zero control over did, but it was still seen as a reflection of her ability as an executive.
It's kind of like blaming the captain of a ship for its course, even though the ship is on autopilot and heading straight into a storm.
Exactly. And this tendency to put too much emphasis on individual responsibility also showed up in how people reacted to Roger Maris breaking Babe Ruth's home run record. Milana now points out that if you look at the stats, a random spike like Maris's was actually pretty likely to happen, but at the time, everyone thought it was because Maris was just that talented and worked so hard.
So it makes you wonder, how often do we overemphasize individual talent or genius when really chance had a lot to do with it? It's easy to get caught up in that narrative of the self-made person who did it all themselves. But reality is often more complicated. There's always some element of luck involved, even in the most incredible success stories.
And this isn't saying that hard work and talent don't matter. It's more that we need to be aware of how often luck shapes outcomes in ways that we don't even realize. It's a more realistic and I think humble perspective that can help us avoid being unfair in our judgments or setting unrealistic expectations for ourselves and others.
This is especially important when it comes to things like finance, where past performance is often used to predict future success. But Milana uses some pretty eye-opening visuals to show how that's a myth.
He uses two graphs that really make you think. The first one tracks how the top 100 mutual funds performed over a 5-year period. It's a smooth curve that suggests a direct correlation between skill and how much money they made. But then he shows the second graph, which tracks the same funds over the next 5 years. And guess what? The order is completely different. It looks more random than anything, like there's no pattern.
So the funds that were at the top for the first 5 years didn't stay there. It basically became random.
Exactly. And that's a powerful visual reminder that past performance, even in something like finance, is a surprisingly bad predictor of future success. So this brings up a big question. If past performance isn't reliable, what should you actually consider when making investment decisions? Well, one important thing is understanding regression to the mean, which basically means that things tend to even out over time.
So if a mutual fund does really well one year, it's statistically likely that they'll go back to doing average the next year.
Exactly. And the opposite is true too. A fund that does really poorly one year is likely to do better the next year just because of how the market naturally moves up and down.
So if you're looking for consistent long-term growth, you need to focus on more than just short-term performance.
Mm.
Things like the fund manager's investment philosophy, their risk tolerance, and the overall market conditions are much more reliable indicators of future success.
Absolutely. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the illusion of control. It's tempting to think that we can pick winning stocks or perfectly time the market, but the reality is a lot of it comes down to chance. A more realistic approach is to focus on diversification, long-term investing strategies, and managing risk, rather than trying to outsmart the market. So understanding randomness can actually make us better investors. It helps us manage our expectations, avoid making impulsive decisions, and recognize that we can't predict the future perfectly. It's about finding that balance between taking calculated risks and knowing that chance will always be a factor. All this talk about randomness and luck can be kind of discouraging, you know? It's like, if so much is out of our hands, then why even bother trying? But Mladen now doesn't leave us with that depressing thought. He brings up something really important, the power of persistence.
Yeah, and he illustrates it so well by sharing stories of these famous authors who got rejected tons of times before they made it big. Like John Grisham, for example, his manuscript for A Time to Kill was rejected by 26 publishers before someone finally picked it up.
26 rejection letters. Wow. I
Look at
think
that.
I'd give up after like 5.
I know, right? And it wasn't just Grisham. Dr. Seuss got a crazy 27 rejections for his first kid's book. And to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, and even J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
the one who wrote Harry Potter,
Yeah.
she had to deal with a bunch of rejections before she found a publisher. So even in something like writing, where you'd think talent and creativity are the most important things, luck and persistence still play a huge role. It's like you need some luck to get your work in front of the right person at the right time, but you also need to keep going, even when it feels like it's never going to happen.
Exactly. And those stories are so inspiring because they show us that even when you keep getting knocked down, you can still succeed if you don't give up. Understanding randomness can actually give you more energy to keep trying because it reminds you that luck is part of it. So you shouldn't take those rejections personally or let them stop you from going after what you want.
It's like that quote, success is not, final failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Understanding randomness can actually give you more courage because it helps you see those setbacks as just part of the process, not like a sign that you're not good enough.
For sure. And we need to remember that success doesn't always happen in a straight line. There are going to be ups and downs, twists and turns. But if we embrace persistence and recognize that luck is part of it, we can handle those challenges better and with more determination.
But it doesn't always end happily, does it? Mladen also talks about John Kennedy Toole. He killed himself after his book got rejected over and over, and then ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize after he died.
Yeah, that story really makes you think persistence is key, but we got to take care of ourselves too mentally and emotionally. Getting rejected, especially in a creative field, can be so hard. It's super important to have people you can lean on and to find healthy ways to deal with setbacks.
It's like finding that balance between pushing for your goals and knowing when you need to step back and take a breather for your mental and emotional health. Sometimes persistence means knowing when to take a break or ask for help or change your approach instead of just banging your head against a wall.
Exactly. It's about listening to yourself and knowing your limits. Persistence isn't about blindly pushing forward. It's about finding a way to keep going without burning yourself out.
Speaking of things that can be scary and make you anxious, let's talk about cancer clusters.
Right.
It seems like all the time there's some news story about a neighborhood or town where a lot of people are getting cancer and then everyone freaks out and starts blaming the environment. But Mladen now has a really interesting take on this.
He explains that we're often scared of cancer clusters because we don't really understand randomness.
Yeah.
You know, cancer is complicated, it takes a lot of mutations, and often you need to be exposed to high levels of carcinogens for a long time. So just because a bunch of people in a small area get cancer doesn't automatically mean there's something wrong with the environment.
So it could just be a statistical fluke. Like if you flip a coin 10 times and you get heads 7 times, even though it's a 50-50 chance, Doesn't mean the coin is rigged. It's just random.
That's a perfect analogy. Statistically, clusters are going to happen sometimes just because of how cancer cases are randomly spread out. Of course, this doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about environmental risks. But understanding probability can help us look at these situations more rationally.
So don't just believe what you hear from other people or from the media. If you're worried about a cancer cluster where you live, look for actual data and expert analysis before you jump to conclusions. Remember, just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. And even when there is a real environmental risk, understanding the probabilities can help you make better decisions about your health.
It's about finding that balance between being cautious and not freaking out over random data. And this brings us to a bigger point about why it's important to understand the laws of probability in everyday life.
Okay, I'll be honest. Whenever someone starts talking about probability theory, my brain kind of shuts off. It seems like something only math geniuses need to worry about. But Malaja makes a good argument for why understanding even basic probability could be really useful.
He walks us through the history of probability theory and shows how it went from being about analyzing games of chance to having real applications in areas like law, medicine, and even just our everyday decisions. It's pretty cool to see how these ideas that seem kind of abstract are actually the basis for so much of how we understand the world.
So where do we even start? What are some of the key things people should know?
Well, one of the most basic ideas is the sample space, which basically means thinking about all the possible outcomes of something. Like if you're flipping a coin, the sample space is heads or tails understanding that lets you start figuring out the probability of each outcome.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So if you're gambling, knowing the sample space can help you make smarter bets.
exactly. And this leads to another big idea, the law of large numbers, which we talked about earlier. This means that the more times you do something, the closer the results will get to the expected probability. So if you flip a coin 1,000 times, you'll get closer to a 50-50 split between heads and tails than if you only flip it 10 times.
So even if you can't predict what will happen each time, there's still an underlying pattern that shows up when you look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And this idea is super important in a lot of areas. For example, insurance companies use the law of large numbers to figure out risk and set prices. They can't tell which person will file a claim, but they can make pretty good predictions about the overall number of claims based on past data and statistics.
That's interesting. So understanding probability isn't just about knowing the odds in Vegas. It's about realizing how much chance affects our lives in ways we don't even see.
And one of the best examples of this is the story of Joseph Jagger, an engineer back in the 1800s, who used his knowledge of probability to beat the roulette wheel in Monte Carlo. He was sure that roulette wheels weren't perfectly balanced, so he hired people to carefully write down every number that came up on a bunch of different wheels over weeks.
So he was basically collecting data to prove his theory.
Yep. And when he looked at the data, he found patterns in certain wheels. Some numbers were slightly more likely to come up than others.
So he was able to use those tiny imperfections to his advantage.
That's right. Jagger used his understanding of probability to turn a random game into something he could strategically win at. He supposedly won a lot of money before the casino figured out what he was doing and fixed the wheels. It's a great example of how understanding probability can not only help us make sense of the world, but also give us an edge in certain situations.
That's a cool story. Makes me want to go study probability. But I'm guessing there were other people who contributed to this field besides Jagger, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. One key figure was Jacob Bernoulli, a Swiss mathematician who did a lot of important work on probability theory in the late 1600s. He thought that randomness could be understood and even predicted to some extent, and his work really set the stage for modern statistics.
So Bernoulli was basically a pioneer in using math to study random events?
Exactly. He was really interested in applying probability theory to real-world stuff. One of his main insights was that even though you can't predict individual events, the overall pattern of random events becomes more predictable over a large number of trials. It's the law of large numbers in action.
So even though we can't know for sure if a coin will land on heads or tails on one flip, we can make a pretty good guess about the overall split between heads and tails if we flip it 1,000 times.
That's the idea. Bernoulli's work helped change the focus from just describing random events to actually figuring out the rules that govern them. This was a big step towards a more scientific approach to studying probability.
So thanks to Bernoulli and other mathematicians like him, we now have a much better understanding of how randomness works.
Yeah.
And that helps us make better decisions in all sorts of situations.
And yet, even with the best tools and all the knowledge we have, there will always be some things that we just can't predict. Mulata now reminds us that sometimes the best we can do is accept that life is unpredictable and just try to roll with the punches as best we can.
He uses a story from his own family to illustrate this point. He talks about how his mother's best friend Sabina and her husband were killed by the Nazis. They had planned to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto, but a random event messed up their plans.
It's a really sad example of how even the most carefully made plans can be completely ruined by things you can't foresee.
Hmm.
It shows how limited our control really is and how much chance affects our lives. Sometimes things happen that we just can't understand or control, and the best we can do is learn from those experiences and adjust our approach moving forward.
It's a serious reminder that no matter how hard we try to plan and control things, there's always an element of randomness at play. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it?
No, not at all. Embracing the unpredictable can lead to cool opportunities and experiences that we might otherwise miss. It's about finding a balance between making plans for the future and being open to unexpected turns that life throws our way.
This makes me think of that ancient Greek philosopher Zeno and his paradox about motion.
Ah, Zeno's paradox. He said that motion was impossible because to get somewhere you'd first have to travel half the distance, then half of what's left, and so on. It creates an infinite series of smaller and smaller steps.
So basically, he was saying you could never actually get anywhere because there would always be another half to travel.
Exactly. It's a pretty mind-blowing thought experiment that highlights how hard it is to grasp the idea of infinity and continuity.
But we obviously do move when we get to where we're going.
Yeah.
So how do you solve this paradox?
The key is the concept of limits, which came much later in math. Even though the number of steps in Zeno's paradox is infinite, the sum of those tiny distances actually adds up to a finite number.
So even though there are infinitely many steps, the total distance you travel is still limited, which means motion is possible.
Exactly. Zeno's paradox shows us that sometimes what seems logical isn't actually true, especially when you're dealing with ideas like infinity. It shows how important math is for understanding and solving these kinds of paradoxes.
It's amazing how math can help us understand even the most counterintuitive ideas. It seems like the more we look into randomness, the more we find connections to all parts of our lives, from how particles move to how successful businesses are to the very nature of reality itself.
And this brings us back to Mladeno's central idea of the drunkard's walk. Just like a drunk person stumbles around unpredictably, our paths in life are shaped by a combination of things we do and random events that are totally out of our control.
It's kind of humbling to realize how much is left up to chance.
But it can also be freeing. Recognizing how much randomness is involved can help us let go of that illusion that we have complete control. It lets us be open to unexpected things and enjoy the journey.
It's like the example Mladen gives about how the total miles driven by American drivers every year stays pretty much the same, even though individual driving habits are all over the place.
It's a great illustration of how, even though individual behavior is unpredictable, it can still result in predictable patterns when you look at the big picture. Mladenow says this isn't just about driving. It also applies to things like the number of accidents and even deaths on the road.
It's like there's some unseen force guiding the overall outcomes, even though individual events are influenced by chance.
It's the law of large numbers doing its thing again. This principle explains why insurance companies can be so accurate in figuring out risks and setting prices, even though they can't predict which individual person will make a claim.
So even though randomness might seem chaotic on a small scale, there's a hidden order that emerges when you zoom out and see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And understanding this has big implications for how we approach everything from personal decisions to public policy. Recognizing the role of randomness can help us make smarter choices both individually and as a society.
This brings us to another interesting point that Mladenow makes about the importance of sample size when you're looking at data. He says we often draw conclusions based on small samples that might not actually represent the whole population.
Right. He uses the example of doing a poll. Let's say you ask a small group of people in a town if they like the mayor. If you only ask 5 people, there's a pretty good chance the results won't really reflect how the whole town feels.
So even if 60% of those 5 people support the mayor, it doesn't mean the mayor has a 60% approval rating in the whole town.
That's the point. Small samples are likely to have fluctuations that don't show the real underlying probabilities. This is where statistical significance comes in.
So statistical significance tells us whether the results we see in a sample are probably just due to chance or if they represent a real trend in the larger population.
Exactly. And the bigger the sample size, the more confident we can be about the results. Mladenow says this is often overlooked, which leads to misinterpretations of data in all sorts of fields, from scientific studies to market research.
It's like those headlines we see all the time about a new study that says some food is linked to cancer, but then a few months later, another study says the opposite.
It's a classic example of how small sample sizes and the lack of statistical significance can lead to conclusions that are just plain wrong. And the media makes it worse by exaggerating research findings.
There's that saying, lies and lies in statistics. It seems like statistics can be twisted to fit whatever story people want to tell, regardless of whether the data actually means anything.
That's why it's so important to be critical of the information we see, especially when it comes to statistics. We need to ask about sample sizes, statistical significance, and whether there were any biases in how the data was collected. Just because a study gets published doesn't mean it's right or that it applies to everyone.
It's empowering to know that we have the tools to evaluate these claims and make up our own minds.
Hmm.
But even with the best statistical analysis, there will always be some uncertainty, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the work of Thomas Bayes comes in. He was a statistician and minister back in the 1700s. Bayes came up with a theorem that helps us update our beliefs as we get new evidence.
So it's not about stubbornly sticking to our original assumptions, but rather being open to changing our minds as we learn more.
Exactly. Bayes' theorem gives us a mathematical way to incorporate new evidence into our understanding of probabilities. It's a powerful tool for dealing with the situations where we don't have all the information and need to make decisions based on the best data we have.
This makes me think of medical diagnoses. Doctors often have to make judgments based on a patient's symptoms and test results, but there's always some level of uncertainty.
Right. And Bayes' theorem can help doctors get better at diagnosing as they gather more information. It lets them adjust their initial probabilities based on the results of more tests or observations. This helps reduce the chances of getting the diagnosis wrong and make sure patients get the best treatment.
It's crazy how a math theorem from hundreds of years ago can still be so useful in modern medicine.
And Bayes' theorem isn't just for medicine. It's used in all kinds of fields, from artificial intelligence to financial modeling. It's a great tool for dealing with uncertainty and making decisions based on the best evidence available.
This reminds me of another mistake people make with probability, the prosecutor's fallacy, which we mentioned earlier. It seems like Bayes' theorem could help avoid this fallacy by encouraging a more complete assessment of probabilities.
You're totally right. By looking at how likely someone was to be guilty in the first place, along with the specific evidence presented, Bayes' theorem helps us avoid the trap of only focusing on the probability of finding that evidence if the person was guilty.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture and not jumping to conclusions based on just one piece of information.
Exactly. And Mlodinow emphasizes that understanding Bayes' theorem can really give you an advantage in life. It helps you make more informed decisions in all sorts of situations.
It's like having this mental framework for updating your beliefs as you get new information. It helps you navigate the world in a smarter and more rational way. It's amazing how Bayes' theorem can apply to so many things. It's like having a mental tool to help us figure out new information and understand the world better.
Totally. It's a really strong framework for thinking about probabilities and changing our beliefs based on what we learn. And this brings us back to expertise and how we can be tricked by randomness when we judge someone's skill.
You mean how we tend to overestimate how much individual skill matters and underestimate the influence of luck in things like finance and investing?
Exactly. Mlodinow says that when you have thousands of fund managers making investment decisions, some of them are bound to have long streaks of success just by chance. It doesn't mean they're not skilled, but it shows how important it is to consider the role of randomness when you're looking at their performance.
So a fund manager who consistently beats the market for a few years might not actually be some kind of genius. They could just be lucky.
Definitely possible. And that's where regression to the mean comes in. Even the best investors will have ups and downs in their performance because of things they can't control over time. Their returns are likely to go back to the average.
This is something really important for investors to remember. We shouldn't get caught up in short-term wins, but instead focus on long-term trends and solid investment principles.
Absolutely. It's tempting to chase after the hottest stocks or funds, but you have to remember that just because something did well in the past doesn't mean it'll do well in the future. Diversification, long-term investing strategies, and managing risk are much more reliable ways to build wealth over time.
So understanding randomness can actually make us better investors. It helps us be more aware of our biases, more careful about our predictions, and more realistic about how much luck plays a role in financial success.
Yeah, it's about having a more balanced view of the market and acknowledging that we can't predict what it's going to do with 100% certainty. And this is something we can apply to other areas of life too.
Like Mlodinow talks about the illusion of control, that thing where We think we have more power to influence outcomes than we actually do, even in situations where chance is a big factor.
He uses studies on lottery tickets as an example. People who pick their own numbers always think their tickets are worth more than the ones where they got random numbers, even though their chances of winning are exactly the same.
So even though it's totally random, just the act of choosing makes us feel more in control.
Yeah.
That's a powerful illusion. And I bet this applies to lots of decisions we make in life.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Choosing a partner, picking a career, making investment decisions, we often think we have way more control over what happens than we really do.
So how do we avoid falling for this illusion? Is it about realizing when chance is a big factor and adjusting our expectations accordingly?
That's a good place to start. Recognizing that we can't control everything can help us avoid unnecessary stress and disappointment. It's about accepting that even the best plans can go wrong because of things we can't predict. And this brings us back to the importance of persistence and resilience.
So it's not about giving up on our goals, but understanding that the path to getting there might not be as smooth as we think.
Exactly. Embracing randomness means accepting that there will be setbacks, detours, and unexpected challenges. It's about adapting, learning from our mistakes, and finding creative ways to overcome obstacles.
This reminds me of what we talked about earlier with those authors who got rejected so many times before they finally got published. It shows how powerful persistence can be and how important it is to never give up on your dreams, even when it seems impossible.
And those stories also show how much luck and timing matter. It's not always enough to be talented and work hard. Sometimes you also need to be in the right place at the right time, and that often comes down to chance.
Makes me think about all the inventions and discoveries that happened because of accidents or chance occurrences, like penicillin, for example.
Right. Alexander Fleming discovering penicillin by accident totally changed medicine. It's a perfect example of how randomness can lead to amazing breakthroughs that we could never have planned.
For the microwave oven that came from a radar experiment.
It's wild how these little accidents or random events can have such a huge impact on our lives. It challenges the idea that progress is always a straight line that we control completely.
I think recognizing how much randomness is involved can also make us more grateful for the success we've had, knowing that luck probably played a role.
Definitely. It makes you humble and grateful. It reminds us that we're not solely responsible for our wins. There are always things happening outside of our control, and chance encounters often lead to opportunities we never even thought about.
And this also makes me think about people who have overcome huge challenges or achieved amazing things despite all the obstacles they faced. Their stories often show how resilient people can be and how adaptable we are to unexpected situations. They prove that even when things are tough, chance encounters and random events can open up new possibilities.
It's inspiring to see how some people can handle the unpredictability of life with grace and determination. Their stories remind us that even though we can't control everything that happens to us, we can choose how we react to those things and shape our own stories.
This deep dive into randomness has been eye-opening. It made us question what we thought we knew, gave us new perspectives, and left us with a sense of wonder about how much chance really affects our lives. If we had to sum it up in one key takeaway, what would it be?
I think the most important thing we learned is that recognizing the role of randomness doesn't mean we should just give up and let fate decide everything. It's about accepting that life is unpredictable and at the same time actively going after our goals, knowing that both chance and our own effort will determine what happens in the end.
So it's not about getting rid of uncertainty, but learning how to deal with it wisely, being resilient and staying humble.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between accepting the things we can't control and taking responsibility for our own choices, knowing that both chance and effort shape where we end up.
Well said. This has been a fascinating look at randomness. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something valuable about how chance influences our world and our lives.